ran across an interesting clip recently with Charlie Kirk of Turning Point USA talking about the Christian origins of of these United States. I'm going to try and get this right. I know, Lucas, you always say it correctly, and I even put it in the title because this is the way that it was traditionally written, as a confederation of states that were, in a confederation. And he talks about how the United these United States were founded in Christian principles, and that the founders were Christian. And this has been argued that it wasn't this way. And he says, well, you've got to look at a lot of the state charters. You have to look at the state constitutions to really see what was going on here, and make some interesting references about the Declaration of Independence. I thought it was a interesting clip, particularly for its historical significance and the things that he is bringing to light. Lucas, have you had a chance to review this one yet?
I did. I watched it actually earlier this morning, which was the first time that I had seen it. I don't. Charlie Kirk wasn't necessarily on my radar, but it's something I'm well aware of. Both the Confederation. We talk a lot about federal now, but federal gets lopped off of the earlier notion of confederation, and the notion, the Articles of Confederation, which the various colonies unified under prior to the Constitution and after the Revolutionary War, was in model of the Iroquois Confederacy. And there was a whole lot of thought and talk about this notion of confederacy. And there's a whole bunch of words that revolve around that con. Are you familiar with where they come from? Think of confidence and conspiracy and
Well, con as a root word meaning with, right?
yes, but it also speaks to something physiological. Can you think of anywhere on your body that is that has cons? I'll take that as a no.
No,
Um,
I'm blanking. No. What part of your body has a con?
your eye has rods and cons or cones.
Hmm.
And if you're familiar with concepts of brain lateralization, um, think about whenever you focus. The rods of your eyes make up the pupil and the iris. And whenever you focus, it's very much your brain is activating and using your eyes. And your cones make up the whites of your eyes, and are also sort of tied to, in some ways, the right side of the brain in the way that you feel. So a confederation and your conscience and confidence and conspiracy have have uh, have a whole association with a feeling of rightness and a not being coerced or forced, not feeling anxious and tense, which is what focusing and using the logical side of your brain is. So that's where we get the Latin word of cones, and there was a long association with that group of words of not being forced. And think also of just sort of religions, and how in some ways you get to vote with your feet. There's a we
Wait a second. Hold on.
okay.
Did you say that the white part of your eye is the like? I'm pretty sure that the only active, and again, this is just straight science here, but pretty sure that the rods and the cones are the photoreceptor cells of the iris, and then the white part is non-active. It's the what I think is called
That
sclera or something like that.
that might be right. But so what I'm drawing off of is a book about brain lateralization by an ophthalmologist and a brain surgeon, and it was called and it's been a while, but I find that looking at different shapes of eyes and And I guess part of why I think about that is sometimes when I'm thinking about these sort of concepts of conspiracy or confidence, I think about peripheral vision. So that's probably an error in mine. But a great book that covers uh, brain lateralization and its association with rods and cones is Alphabet and the Goddess. I don't know if you want to pull that up, but it's a great book for thinking about um, uh, types of political order in which people are not coerced, and when people might have joined in thoughts over religion. It gets a lot into it gets a lot. I mean, one half of our brain is much younger than the other half of our brain, and some people embrace the stoned ape theory. There are other theories as to why we have two lobes to our brain, and one is much younger than the other. But uh, this book makes the case that the older side of our brain led more to concepts of conformity and
Wait, when you said bilateral, did you mean bicameral? Because this book I've read, this one, The Origins of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, this book is wild. Have you ever
uh,
read this?
no, I've never read that. When I say bilateral, I guess I was forming the word from the brain lateralization of the
Okay.
left and right.
So this book makes some pretty outstanding claims and is I don't know how well researched this is or how well substantiated it is, but essentially it says that in times past the brain was bifurcated in a certain way, and that people would actually hear voices in their head that they didn't think was their own, and they thought that that voice that they heard in their head was like divine. And so
Absolutely, Joan of Arc.
right, but what he says in this book, which is a fascinating idea, and I don't know how well substantiated it is, but it's an interesting read, and the thought process to go through is that at one point that it broke down, and it stopped being a division, and so the people who didn't have this bicameral mind started to have a unified brain, and that it occurred at a specific point in time, that this was an evolution.
Interesting. Well, I do think that we turn to I mean, even this discussion about science that we always devolve into does not honor the fact that science is merely a method, and it comes to us from a philosophy. There's a great book that covers the development of the method of science that we have today from the philosophy of Epicureanism, The Swerve by Stephen Greenblatt. It's another favorite of mine, and I don't know if you've stumbled into that, but I definitely think that we rely possibly too much on logic, and certainly, um, in the wake of, say, like the 2016 election, when statisticians are scratching their heads and saying, "But I polled it. I thought I thought numbers couldn't lie." And I think that there's another level of understanding that people create a narrative to match. Well, going back to that brain lateralization, were you aware that the left side of our brain operates more slowly than the right side of our brain? And the cones immediately create a picture of the world that is instantaneous. However, the left side of the brain, it runs on, I believe, 40 millisecond lag.
Well, I this idea of left and right brain, I think, has been called into question at some point. Not 100% sure that that's still the thought process of
Well,
how the brain works. But I did see this, which I'm not sure if you saw this. That there's experiments going on about whether the speed at which information is transferred in neurons, that the only way that it could operate at the speed that it does is through quantum entanglement, which is a pretty crazy experiment, which is currently being explored in China.
I have seen this, and I find it fascinating. I I would say that, but yes, I do. I have seen the questioning of brain lateralization, and I think that speaks to the fact that it's not um, that the left and right lobes of the brain have long operated next to each other, and so
Well,
it's
I think some of the studies that I saw done that have started to refute that idea that there's a left and a right side of the brain is they've put people into high into MRI machines, and those they looked at, okay, where's the brain activity when you're doing certain types of tasks? Like, is there a differentiation between creative and analytical? Is there a differentiation which side of your brain is active when you're doing these things? Is there any, you know, credence to that? And I think that that's been pretty well dispelled using an MRI technology. It's not to say that maybe there's something else and we're not detecting it because there's brain activity that wouldn't be sensed by an MRI or something like that. There's always room for that. But I think as far as our current understanding of how the brain works and, you know, how to measure activity, I don't think the left-right division has survived scrutiny by the MRI.
well, it's handy. I mean, we also think in quite often we break things down to to two. I mean, parties. We break things into two to think about them. So and I find it easy, but I totally get that. I know that our vision also, whenever you have brain damage or your vision is impaired, that it also is very interesting as to how our vision like mirrors and is created into a picture in our heads. But going to like the creation of the narrative that we have certainly follows our feelings, and there are also, or is are not is a study in which using I don't know if it's MRIs, but tracking electrical synapses in the brain, that it's apparent that decisions are made in the brain before action is actually taken by the body, and I believe that's like a 40 millisecond lag.
All right.
And
Well, we've strayed pretty far afield from our given topic here. Not that I don't mind delving into some ideas about, brain chemistry and bicameral minds and scientific research and what have you. But should we try and steer back towards
sure,
what we
yeah,
thought we were going to
we
talk about
did
today?
take a hard right with all based on Confederation. So wow. Um, th- I think also why I wanted to talk about that was because getting into religion, there is and the nation state too. These are growing concepts. There was a Italy before World War II never thought of itself as Italy. It thought of itself as principalities. There's also notions of how we are bound to each other, bound to the land, bound to a home, that come to us for different ways of organizing ourselves in the world. And religion is how it was done for millennia. And so this notion that there is a separation of church and state, I think, is a fantasy that we tell ourselves. Just like this notion that justice is not political, that seems to have wills for people in power, and yet is apparent not to be true by people who are out of power. Um, and so when anyone tells me that there is separation of church and state, I am quick to point out that that was a concept that came to us from Europe, going back to the Holy Roman Empire and the Catholic Church, and that was a break from feudalism. And there was also a notion of separating your body from your soul, and the Catholic Church had control over our souls and where we went to in the metaphysical hereafter. But a king or your neighbors had control of your body, or your Lord had control of your body. The person who gave you bread, Lord, comes to us from loaf. What are you pulling up here, by the way? Oh, state constitutions.
Just supporting documentation for what Charlie Kirk said. I mean, this is not the first time I've heard this argument that there's this idea of Christian nationalism, and there have even been political candidates who ran on such tickets, especially during some times when I was very active in politics, and so this is not a new concept to me. Hearing Charlie Kirk talk about this, because it's definitely not referenced at the federal level as well as it is at the state level, but I think that's because it's lost in our common discussion of what these United States are, because we're thinking about our nation as a singular nation instead of a loose confederation of states. And since that's not really how these United States were thought about in the past, that if you go looking for certain things, you have to look in the right spots. If you're looking for it at the federal level, you're not necessarily going to find it, but at the state level, it's irrefutable that it was referenced over and over again.
Amen. And I mean, there's untold number of ways that you can track this, but I think it's most important, and part of the tragedy of this adoption of quote unquote separation of church and state goes to speak to the powers and the jurisdictions of the states versus the federal government. I was watching the Democratic National Convention yesterday or this morning, and listening to some of the speeches, and it makes me sad to hear of and to think of the division in the United States today. Whenever I think this speaks to so much of the problem, because I kept thinking, great idea, but that's not the jurisdiction of the federal government. And the federal government, or the Constitution, which created the federal government, was not one. The Constitution does not deal with giving the rights of the Bill of Rights. And this was a concern of John Adams and oh, now I'm blanking. Not Hamilton, Madison. James Madison was very wary of the Bill of Rights being confusing to the layperson in understanding how the government worked, because the states are given the power and the jurisdiction over our bodies. And think about how that narrative conflicts with the narrative of abortion. Are given control over our bodies and property and the land. And the actual Constitution is not concerned with giving rights. The actual Constitution is a document that is an agreement between the states that have control over these bodies.
Right. The Constitution was not intended to grant the rights, but rather it said that the rights were given by the Creator to mankind.
Well, and this is where it gets ironic and sticky. It was a much simpler document. Whenever the Constitution was an agreement between states that guaranteed the liberty of movement of the citizens of those states from state to state. And whenever amendments are tacked on, notice that the amendments are applied to the citizens of the states and guarantee, quote unquote, rights or freedoms to the citizens of those states. But this is why I also think it's so very important to think of the difference between liberty and freedom, because if freedom is the place of the mother, I mean, think of kingdom and freedom and begin to break those apart. Freedom is a compound word coming from Norse or Germanic roots that meant Freya, the home, the mother god in Norse mythology, and the place or the contract or the place of the mother, and that came to notions of taxation. When you go home and you don't wash a dish, does your mother get as angry at you as, say, your roommate? Or does your mother charge you to stay in your room? I mean, mine might, but you can see how that notion of a lower taxation or a greater acceptance is piggybacked on the notion of freedom as opposed to liberty, which is Latin for air, to move about like free air. So, um, but anyway, to the question,
Well, the
I
separation of church and state, right? The like, should we talk on that for a minute? Because like this is the clause that people use to talk about the separation of church and state, right? And really, it was that there would be no establishment of a state-sponsored religion, which is like what we had in
a-
times past in England, right?
amen. And notice it says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of a religion. So that doesn't say the states shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, because they wouldn't have adopted the amendments if it had said the states cannot do so. They already had constitutions of their own. You know, there's not just one constitution of these United States. There are 52, 54, 51 or 50. There's over 50 of them, because you have the federal constitution and each of the states have their own constitutions. And those the states' constitutions are very different, again, because they do apply to the bodies. They have the writ of habeas corpus, which is Latin for the human body. Or actually, I'm not sure what habeas corpus means. So this is where you get into problems of using the federal government and the powers that are granted it by a constitution that was limiting it to commerce between the states, and not giving it authority over the bodies, and that becomes, we in the wake of the civil.
Well, that comes back to the original idea of what was this supposed to be, right? Because the states were supposed to be more like what we would canonically think of nations, right? If you think about the way that Europe is structured before the European Union, you had all these different nations and they had borders and they had a way that they interacted. And so this idea of forming a united states is, I think, in a lot of ways very similar to what has been attempted in the European Union.
Yes, and think also nacion is to be born in Latin, not Nacion, nacion and nation. So in a feudalist organization, you were either born to nobility, or you were born and bound to the land, and or maybe a house. But so nation began, that there was a with the growth of the Catholic Church, and people trying to get away from feudalism, there became this thought as to, well, where do you actually belong? If you can move about Europe, if you can move from kingdom to kingdom, if you were born in a valley, in a vassal's protectorate, but the church granted you, and this is where Boxing Day comes from, by the way. um, the Orthodox and the Catholic Church had different ideas about what was morally right for the different classes of people, but both of them agreed that it was wrong to bind people to the land for their entire lives and for generations. So it said, well, people can move around. And so that's where the idea of Boxing Day comes from. The Orthodox Church in Russia said that, well, there is one day of year, and if a serf is unhappy with their lord, then they can get up and move on that one day. And the Catholic Church gave a larger window of time for people to get up and move about. But this is where the idea of nation comes from. Where were you born? What is your nacion? And the United States carried forth with that idea, with this notion of liberty, and saying, we're going to transfer the rights that are given to you from the place that you were born to wherever you want to move to, and that will be part of the power or the agreement between these various states, is that if you don't like the Quaker religion of Massachusetts, then you can move down to Maryland and be a Catholic. But we're not gonna go by the way of Europe that had failed, and think about France and the Hugenots, or England, and the fight between Henry VIII and the Catholic Church, and the killing of the citizens when the king decided it was more expedient not to be Catholic or to be Catholic, and declared that all the people who lived in the lands that he controlled become Catholic or become Protestant, as whatever they decided was expedient for them. So the fight between the Huguenots, by the way, would be how we come up with the Napoleon. And I mean, the Napoleonic Rebellion, or the Napoleonic, I don't know what you want to call it, in France has everything to do with the Catholic control of the monarchy. The monarchy had been established by now I can't think of the line of kings, famous line of kings, with the Catholic Church, aligned with the Catholic Church, and they had given the authority to the kings to decide what to do with the people in the lands there. Are you familiar with the Huguenots, or is that a new one on you?
I'm not a great student of history. I've said this many times. Like, my path in life took the way of mathematics and science, and later computers. So I have unfortunately spent less time in the world of history. I'm familiar with the term Huguenots, and so I pulled it up. So I'm kind of just parsing through it, and I recognize a lot of the names and the references, but no, I wasn't particularly familiar with this term.
Well, you mentioned earlier the hearing voices in your head, and that's both Joan of Arc and any other number of mystics heard voices in their head. It's also a very handy way to try to get other people to do what you want. And one way that I think about religion too is it's a shared narrative. And we have money today. There's a German mystic whom I dearly love, and her name is Hildegard de Bingen, and she said that nature is God. How did she put it? Nature is God's mirror, and God is a mirror that we look through when we can't see ourselves in others. And so, some people are concerned, like these metaphysical, like who or what is God. But in some ways, God is a shared narrative between people. And you can think of how the phenomenon of God or religion comes, and part of it is conflict resolution. So if you're fighting over land, or a deer that you shot somewhere, and somebody says, "Well, no, that was mine," or "That's my land," or "That's my deer that you killed." One way to seek conflict resolution is to say, "Well, Grandma wouldn't have wanted us to fight," and if it's not Grandma, as you get further and further in relations away, it might be great grandma or great great grandma or great 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 grandma, and after a while, that might just become God, a shared idea of how order was supposed to occur. So anyway, I certainly think that that, you know, we also mentioned a couple of days ago this idea of writing down the rules and that replacing a king and having some sort of written contract between people. But how different is that than, say, the Bible or the um, the Torah or the the Quran, or maybe even the Bhagavad Gita. You know, all religions have something written down that becomes an agreement between the people. But the maybe the difference that in our minds between religions and what a government is that you can get up and walk into church and walk out, but you can't necessarily do that with a government, or there are more rules. But I think, like, going back to a notion of understanding our governments more in the terms of religions and thinking of them as something that you can voluntarily enter or voluntarily leave is the way of the future. And that's an unsettling thought to some people who want to pretend that there are not moral decisions that are made when groups of people are forced to live near or with each other.
So the idea that Charlie Kirk talks about in this particular clip, the thing that kicked off the conversation, do you think that he mostly gets this right, or do you think that there's some stuff in here that isn't accurate?
I thought he got it bang on right, and maybe even dug into it a little bit more than me. I sort of lament this repetition of the separation of church and state that gets thrown in my face all the time. I know that it doesn't exist in the Constitution, and that the Bill of Rights. You know, I knew that there were those issues with the Bill of Rights. This is part of why my complaints with the judiciary too. I thought it very interesting that he pointed out the Warren Commission and the Warren Court that began to push that a little bit further. I think this also, you know, goes to problems in a reinterpretation of the Constitution in the wake of the Civil War. You know, part of the confusion that's created here is the 14th Amendment magically creates dual citizenship for the citizens of the several states, and suddenly applies a national citizenship to them too. However, it does not, in doing so, it does not convey to the federal government the writ of habeas corpus. And the Constitution addresses that, and it says the executive may suspend the writ of habeas corpus in times of national defense. But it's one thing to call somebody a citizen, but what does that mean? And what does that mean if you do not have power over their body? And I find that has become problematic in the use of the limitations in federal authority to commerce. So you know, in the wake of that, you have more civil rights legislation that is piggybacked on the Commerce Clause of the Constitution, and that also leads to relying on assumptions made about what is going on in people's minds, and what's assumptions about what's going on in people's minds and telling them what to do with their bodies is the place of religion. And we should understand it as, we should understand that there is a place for that in government, and they must meet at some point. But going to some artificial narrative about how that occurred in the history of the federal union has created a lot of dissension in people today. And so, you know, I like to tell people, I don't know. I talk about politics. I argue with people about politics all the time, and sometimes people say, you know, which box are you in? Are you a socialist? Because you're talking socialist ideas. Are you a Republican? Are you a Democrat? And I like to say, well, when it comes to the federal government, I'm a Republican, and I believe in the democratic republics. I don't I don't like the notion of the republic psyop of the Constitution, because there were democratic republics that existed before then, and those were the former colonies that had come together under the Articles of Confederation. And the Constitution was supposed to be a revision of that document. And so, but when it comes to, state governments, or especially municipal governments, I think that we should be thinking in terms of empowering religions to have some sort of autonomy and control over the people who enter into that religion. I think that pretending that they are not related and expecting people to mix and live together is, gives some people an unfair path in life. Are you familiar with the Johnson Amendment?
No. What's the Johnson Amendment?
So civil rights legislation comes after the assassination of JFK. It's pushed forth by Lyndon Baines Johnson, and part of that legislation was the Johnson Amendment. And the Johnson Amendment forbids leaders of religious organizations from engaging in political speech. And I don't know that it has ever been enforced. And the problem that I find with the likes of the Johnson Amendment, that is if religions are the source and a place to have a conversation about your ideal form of politics, like in some ways religions are the safe place. A church is not a building, it's a group of people, and it's a group of people who agree on a vernacular and a way of talking about how they what their expectations are of others, and what their expectations are of others to do with their bodies. Are you supposed to wash the dishes when you're done with them, or can you leave them in the sink for a couple of hours? Are you supposed to soak them, or are you supposed to put them in the dishwasher? Do we want to pay for a dishwasher? That's the place of religion, and so I think it's sad that we enacted the Johnson Amendment, and those that I would say that religions, or people who are parts of religions that are prominent or have a large voice in politics say, "Yay, that's wonderful," but those people who are part of small, I don't know, not smaller, but whatever, smaller religions have the
Small congregations? Are you saying like small groups?
Well, I'm also thinking about both like newer
There's that
religions.
con word again, congregation.
Absolutely, congregation. It's all, and it has to do with the people who came into the church came of their own volition. They were not forced to do so. And it's a very different thing to have a political discussion with people who came to the meeting. This is also why I think it very fascinating that the federal court has tribunals, and think of that relation to tribute as opposed to trials that are held at the state level, because the state has the authority of coercion. And why I also think it, there's all this hand wringing about Sharia law, and that's mainly by Christians. And I say, well, if Christians had the possibility of having a court system that both parties agreed to go in and sit before a jury or a judge or members of their congregation, then they might have a very different opinion as to the fairness or the justice of the decision that was disseminated from that court. And a court is a place, again, church is a Greek word, not for a building, but a group of people. But a court is a place. It is not a court is not a trial nor a tribunal. And so notice how whenever the press covers federal tribunals, they can't say federal trial, because it's not a trial. If the Constitution was entered in by good faith agreements, and also originally a confederacy, a union, a a union of friendship, I believe is what the Confederacies or the Articles of Confederation say, a union based on the friendship of the different states, then how could you ever force one of them to go sit in judgment? Because who would the judge be? And so yeah, religion is.
So this idea of forcing, then, because we did talk a bit about what happened with Lincoln and the actual time during which we had a realignment of how the states were going to operate, right? And this idea that you could leave the union or not leave the union. Is that when the idea of coercion at the federal level started to really change? Was it Civil War?
Oh, absolutely. There's a decision issued by the Supreme Court and by Roger Taney, who is famous for the Dred Scott decision, but also for a decision called Ex Parte Merryman or Ex Parte Merryman. And Ex Parte Merryman was about Maryland. And Maryland is very interesting because, going back to the question of whether these United States is religious or not, there's another tension in the history of the United States, which we conveniently forget, but has everything to do with the tension between Catholics and Protestants. And the War of 1812, we drove the Catholics out of New York City and probably out of Maryland. I don't remember it as well, but part of the reason that, and going back to Catholic France and what Canada is today, Canada means the basket of the Mississippi River, the drainage of the Mississippi River. But it goes to that was where Catholics fled from the Protestant states. And but Ex Parte Merryman, sorry, history is so much fun. There's all these convoluted paths to take. There was a farmer in Maryland who did not approve of the coercion being the coercion, the notion of federal troops doing aught to protect or to fight against the states that had, as they saw it, entered into an agreement of their own volition and possibly could leave of their own volition. They thought a federal army would be to protect them against natives, Indians, or to protect against invasions by the likes of the British. And so Merryman, I believe it was John Merryman. Yeah, John Merryman, he either put up a fence or took down a bridge across his land so that the militia, or the federal militia, could not cross. And in doing so, the leader of that army took him and held a military trial for him. And Roger Taney, who was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at the time, issued an ex parte. Also, I should add, means that one of the parties didn't show up, because and this goes to this whole notion earlier that we also covered with Anna Paulina Luna's inherent contempt. In the federal government was also put in not a state, so that no one owned any one body in that area, and it was a place of diplomatic immunity, and so you could not put a member of Congress in jail, nor could you summon them into a courtroom to sit before justice. And so ex parte is this notion of, well, one of the parties didn't show up. And so, and the Supreme Court at that point could issue all the decisions that they want, but they're very wary to issue ex parte decisions, because if you're telling two groups of people, if you have a brother and a sister who are fighting, and you say, well, I'm going to solve this dispute, but one of them doesn't come to listen to your ruling, who's lost power there? The court has lost the power. And Taney issued this ruling against Lincoln, and said that that he could not suspend the writ of habeas corpus. And Lincoln ignored him and threw several thousand people in jail. And many of those thousands of people, including members of Congress, representatives from different states, most of them were actually members of the press. And especially
a lot of what I've been learning about what happened during the Civil War here was Lincoln basically just spitting in the face of things that had been done in the past or the ways that things had been done previously, right?
Well, and it's not that. Yes, Lincoln began to take the tools of government that had been laid down at the federal level and use them in a way that quite honestly goes also back to the intent of the Constitution, or the designers of the Constitution. You know, it was, and that's why it gets very problematic and confusing to point your finger at Lincoln and say, well, look what you've done. He was both morally motivated, and not only that, but in the design of the Constitution. And this is also why I find I think Oliver Ellsworth is one of the most interesting people to think of in terms of the design of the Constitution. He came up with the Virginia Plan. He was also the second Chief Justice of the United States after John Jay. And he sort of dispels this notion that the federal or the Supreme Court is going to have juries. And going to, like, this great question of, if you're going to design countries or a union of countries that do not rely on God and God giving, whispering in the ear or the mind of a king, and that being the font of justice or the final authority on moral questions, then who is that? And I think that John Adams was the other person who spoke to the ideas of justice and an adversarial versus inquisitorial. And when I say inquisitorial, think of the Great Inquisition of the Catholic Church and the Pope and the various the kings and princes who were aligned with the Catholic Church as being able to look into the minds of people and, maybe burn them at the stake or torture them and decide whether they meant what they said or didn't mean what they say. So those are some of the problems of that America is coming out of. And Oliver Ellsworth, Oliver Ellsworth, you might look up Georgia versus Brainsworth, and that was a case, maybe the fifth or sixth case seen by the Supreme Court, in which it was decided by a jury, or which a federal jury was called. And Oliver Ellsworth thought, oh, we can't have that. We can't have that. But so yes, religion is tied to politics. There were maybe other things that I thought about in digging in this far back in history, but it's not just Lincoln. It's not just Lincoln. There was design into how the federal government was to be run, in which there were people who thought, well, we can't just have this people running around with guns.
I can't find that Georgia v. Brainsworth.
Georgia, the state of Georgia versus you might scroll down I'm sure it's got to be in the Wikipedia article for Oliver Ellsworth.
Only one reference to Georgia.
Well, I'm telling you. Do you know who wrote?
Sounds like an edit is in order here.
So it is incredibly hard. And going back to, I think that Oliver Ellsworth disagreed with and this has been something that I have been digging into lately, because in the wake of our conversations here, and questions that they brought up with myself, it led me down this path of why don't we have federal juries? And then I find Oliver Ellsworth presided over federal jury and made sure that didn't happen again. He's a founding father, not only a founding father, but signed the Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, and the Declaration of Independence. He's somebody that we almost never hear about. And you get him in to think, something else that I thought very fascinating is that John F. Kennedy wrote one entry in the encyclopedia, and that entry was a biography, and that biography was for Oliver Ellsworth. And so somebody that, and it's also an incredibly, like, what's the movie with the devil, the greatest thing that he ever did was convince us he didn't exist. It becomes a powerful thing to maybe a level of deification to disappear from a history, and to have had, Oliver Ellsworth also, I believe, formed the Virginia Plan. And the Virginia Plan is, there was the Connecticut Plan that said, well, the state's representation in the Union or in the federal government should be based on their population. And the Republican rich, farm owners, tobacco plantation owners of Virginia and the southern states wanted it to be representation by state. And Oliver Ellsworth was one of the chief backers of the Virginia Plan also.
Here's the Encyclopedia Britannica entry by John F. Kennedy.
Oh my goodness, written by John F. Kennedy himself. I haven't seen this. I'll be reading this the moment that we get that we're done with the show.
As referenced yesterday, it's like I have this have to live GeoGuess and search out these things that get mentioned on the show.
Well, it's great. It's great. So yeah, and think back to that. Like, think also to John F. Kennedy's. He was notable at the time for being a Catholic leader and the first. And there were, what was the complaint about Catholic? Again, going to supposed notions about the United States being both a place of religious quote unquote freedom, a place, and the original.
I think it was the freedom to practice your particular religion versus having one imposed on you.
Well, it was. I mean, when religious freedom means that the notion for a religion to find an area and to not tax the people who came into their area. It didn't mean the liberty to move about to these areas of religious freedom. Freedom is a concept that has everything to do with taxes. And so
well, it was my understanding that the criticisms that were leveled upon John F. Kennedy being a Catholic is that it somehow made the United States subservient to the Pope in some sense.
Well, and look at Thomas Massie and this notion of dual citizenship and concerns about AIPAC today, and these notions that that people can be part of a religion, and that religion gives them a voice in their head that isn't from their constituents. And this is also the problems of a democracy, and why we don't have a democracy and we have a republic, and a republic of people who have some sort of stake in the union or the various states. And so I'm as wary, again, so the history of the United States also is one of that was supposedly of the liberty to seek religious freedom, shall we say, but that immediately begins to be thwarted and to be one that becomes controlled by Protestant interests and Protestant power. And the Catholics, and think also in our history of the unpopularity of Irish, and it wasn't because they were Irish, it was because they were Catholic. And even the Mexican-American Revolution and our fights with Spain are also all about the difference between Protestant order and Catholic order, and how all of these French, Irish, Spanish colonies were engaged in their own union, and that was that they were Latin countries, and they followed the authority of the Pope, and Protestants, maybe with well-founded political concerns, but ill-begotten humanitarian concerns, were wary of the authority of not even Italy, but the Catholic order of the world, and I think that that's still a tension that we see today. But to me, the answer is remembering that that is both honoring and giving power to the various Protestant churches to engage in their local governments. We should be empowering them at a local level, but we should also do so for not only Catholics, but Jewish synagogues, or I don't know what we call groups of Jewish people. I mean, and think of like the Hasidic movement in Brooklyn, but also we should be doing so for Muslim or Islamic groups that have moved to the United States, for Hindu groups that have moved to the United States. If the answer is to bind like codes of moral ethics to various regions, and to allow the movement from place to place to place, this also gets to the understanding of the Democratic Party of the, I don't know, the treasured history of liberty in the United States and what that actually means. But they have forgotten that, if you're going to have liberty, then you need to grant authority on some level for people to enforce their moral understanding of the world. And I think that's things that we've forgotten in America today. The grand psyop of the equation of liberty and freedom is all about religion.
As usual, when we have a topic like this, it seems like the hour just is immediately gone. I think this has been fascinating. I'm really glad that we had a chance to dive into this. A lot of things that we pulled up, so I'll have that all in the description. If you catch this later and you're trying to look up something that we had on the screen, it'll all be there in the description. But yeah, I think we're right at the top of the hour. I think it's a good place to end, unless you've got something else you wanted to throw in there.
I really enjoyed it. One of my favorite conversations to have. So I wish that the Democratic National Convention would throw this episode up on a big screen and boot off one of those glad-handing politicians who's not saying anything. But we'll have to let the word sort of seep out a little more slowly.
All right. Well, we'll see you tomorrow.
All right. Ciao.